The first time it happened, the sun was barely climbing over the ridge of the hills. Birds were chirping, dew clung to the grass, and the peaceful silence of our street was broken by the metallic clank of an aluminum ladder unfolding. I peeked out the kitchen window and nearly spilled my coffee. A man in a stiff polo shirt, clipboard under one arm, was planting a ladder against our house. He didn't knock. He didn't call. He didn't even look around to see if anyone was home. He just set that ladder up like he owned the place, Grandpa. I shouted, running to the porch. "You're not going to believe this. There's some guy trying to climb onto our roof." Grandpa shuffled over, leaning on his cane. His silver hair caught the morning light, and his eyes, though softened by years of living, still burned when he saw something wrong. He followed my gaze and froze. "Not again," he muttered. I turned. "What do you mean, not again?" Grandpa sighed, his jaw tightening. "That's Nelson. He's with the HOA. This is the third time he's tried this nonsense." Nelson, the self-declared compliance officer, was the kind of man who walked around with a permanent scowl. He lived 2 blocks down, and for reasons I still didn't understand, he had declared war on our family. "Excuse me?" Grandpa barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" Nelson flinched, then straightened. "Routine inspection. HOA requires roof measurements. Gotta make sure no unauthorized modifications have been made." "Roof measurements?" I scoffed. "This is our home, not your playground." But Nelson was already halfway up the ladder. His shoes squeaked against the rungs. Grandpa stepped forward, cane digging into the ground. "Nelson, if you don't get down right now, you're going to regret it." Nelson looked over his shoulder with a smirk. "Oh, is that a threat, old man? Careful, I could write you up for harassment." That was Nelson's power trip. He believed every HOA rule was his personal weapon. And truthfully, most neighbors cowered before him. But Grandpa was different. He'd survived wars, rebuilt barns with his bare hands. He'd raised 3 kids in tougher times than Nelson could ever imagine. "Threat?" Grandpa said softly, almost kindly. "No, just a promise." The way he said it sent chills down my spine. That night, as we sat at the dinner table, Grandpa leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his chest. "I've had enough," he said firmly. "That man thinks he can trample over people's rights just because he wears a polo shirt with a logo. But he's about to learn something. What are you going to do?" I asked nervously. Grandpa gave me a sly smile. The kind I remembered from my childhood back, when he used to rig up harmless pranks on Halloween. "Sometimes, son, the best way to stop a fool climbing where he doesn't belong is to make climbing impossible." The next morning I understood what he meant. Grandpa stood in the garage, an old cast iron skillet sizzling on the stove. The smell of bacon filled the air. He whistled as he flipped the strips, not to eat them, but to collect the grease in an old coffee can. Grandpa," I said, "you making breakfast or starting a war?" He chuckled. "Both." Sure enough, Nelson returned 2 days later at nearly the same time. Clipboard tucked under his arm, smug look on his face, ladder dragging behind him like a knight's lance. I watched from the porch, my heart racing. Grandpa stood quietly by the garage, cane in one hand, the other resting in his pocket. Nelson propped the ladder against our gutter and started climbing again. But this time slip, his foot slid right off the rung. He caught himself, muttered, and tried again. Slipped. His face reddened as his shoes squealed against the greasy rungs. "What the?" he hissed. "Why is this ladder so slippery?" From the porch, Grandpa called out, "Looks like bacon fat, doesn't it?" The funny thing about ladders, they don't like grease. Just like folks don't like trespassers. Nelson froze, his eyes wide. He turned to glare at Grandpa. "You sabotaged my ladder? That's illegal." Grandpa's lips curled into a half smile. "Illegal? You stepped onto my property without permission. Trespassing. That's not just illegal. Son, that's downright stupid." I couldn't hold back my laugh. Though I quickly covered my mouth, Nelson scrambled down, wiping his hands on his khakis. "You'll regret this, old man. The HOA will hear about your behavior." Grandpa took one slow step forward, leaning on his cane. His voice dropped into a steady growl. "And the sheriff will hear about yours." Nelson hesitated, then stomped off, dragging the ladder like a sulking child. That night, Grandpa and I sat on the porch under the stars. He rocked gently in his chair, sipping iced tea. "Grandpa," I asked softly, "do you ever get tired of fighting?" He thought for a long moment, then said, "Fighting? No. But I get tired of bullies thinking they can scare decent folks. Sometimes it ain't about winning or losing. It's about showing them they picked the wrong family." I nodded, feeling a swell of pride. But little did we know, this wasn't over. Nelson wasn't the kind of man to lick his wounds and walk away. And the next move he made would change everything. 3 days passed. At first things seemed quiet, almost too quiet. Nelson hadn't been by. No ladder clanking in the early morning, no smug grin peeking over our fence. Grandpa said nothing about it, though I caught him polishing his cane on the porch like a soldier maintaining his weapon before battle, but peace never lasts long when pride is wounded. On the 4th afternoon, a knock rattled our front door loud, sharp, deliberate. I opened it to find 3 people standing on our porch. Nelson, of course, arms crossed, smirk plastered across his face. Beside him stood a woman in a crisp blazer, hair pulled tight into a bun. Another man in a suit who carried a leather briefcase. The woman spoke first, her voice cool and sharp. "Good afternoon. I'm Ms. Harker, president of the HOA board. This is Mr. Barlow, our legal counsel. We're here to discuss a very serious violation committed by your father." Grandpa stepped into view behind me, his cane tapping the floorboards. "Grandfather," he corrected firmly. "And you're standing on my porch, so mind your tone." Ms. Harker blinked, but pressed on. "We've received a report that you tampered with an HOA officer's equipment, endangering his safety. This is a direct violation of the community covenant and subject to immediate fines." Nelson puffed up his chest. "Not to mention attempted assault," he added smugly. I felt heat rising in my chest. Assault. He was trespassing on our roof. Mr. Barlow, the lawyer, cleared his throat. "If there's evidence of intentional sabotage, your family could be liable for damages."
Ow.
That was the moment Grandpa laughed. Not a mocking laugh, but a deep, rolling chuckle that made even the lawyer shift uncomfortably. "You folks don't get it, do you?" Grandpa said, leaning forward on his cane. "The only violation here is that man dragging his ladder onto my lawn without permission. I didn't tamper with his gear. But even if I had, a homeowner's got every right to defend his property from trespassers." Nelson opened his mouth, but Grandpa raised his hand. "And before you twist my words, let me be clear, nobody got hurt. Except maybe his pride." I swear I saw the corner of Mr. Barlow's mouth twitch like he was fighting back a smile. But Ms. Harker snapped her clipboard shut. "We'll see how smug you are when the fines arrive in your mailbox," she snapped. "Good day." The trio turned and marched off the porch, Nelson trailing behind with a glare that could have burned holes in the siding. That night, fine cames lit under our door like some mafia threat. A bold print letter claiming Grandpa owed $5,000 for endangerment, known compliance, and harassment of an HOA officer. I slammed it on the table. "This is robbery. They can't do this." Grandpa studied the letter calmly, then folded it in half and set it aside. "That's not a fine, son. That's a scare tactic." "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice cracking with worry. He leaned back, eyes fixed on some distant memory. "I'm going to remind them that fear cuts both ways." The following morning, Nelson came again. But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 HOA volunteers, big men with clipboards and measuring tape flanked him like bodyguards. They didn't bring a ladder this time. Instead, they walked the perimeter of our house, jotting down notes, snapping photos, whispering to each other. Grandpa and I stood on the porch, silent. "What do you think they're doing?" I muttered. "Fishing," Grandpa said. "Looking for anything they can twist into a violation." Sure enough, an hour later, another letter appeared. This one listed a series of so-called violations. Our grass was half an inch too long. Our mailbox paint was faded. And even our American flag was not regulation size. Each came with a fine attached. Total. $7,200. It felt like a punch to the gut, Grandpa. My voice wavered. We don't have that kind of money. What if they try to take the house? He looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected. Not fear, not anger, sadness. This house, he said quietly, was where your grandmother and I built our life. Every board, every nail, every memory, it's ours. And I'll be damned if I let some petty tyrant strip it away. His voice cracked just slightly, and it shook me. Grandpa never cracked. I clenched my fists. So what do we do? Grandpa straightened, the sadness hardening into steel. We fight, but not the way they expect. The next week was a whirlwind. Nelson kept coming, sometimes with more board members, sometimes alone. Each visit brought more pictures, more letters, more threats. But Grandpa? He was planning every night. He sat at the kitchen table with stacks of papers spread before him, old deeds, property maps, legal documents, letters from when he first bought the house 50 years ago. His hands shook sometimes as he traced the yellowed pages, but his eyes never wavered. One night I asked, "What are you looking for?" "Proof," he whispered. "Proof they have no authority here." And then he found it. At nearly midnight, Grandpa slammed his hand on the table, startling me awake from where I'd nodded off on the couch. He held up a worn, folded deed. "This," he declared. "This land was annexed before the HOA was formed, which means this property was never legally under their jurisdiction. All their fines, all their threats, it's smoke and mirrors." My jaw dropped. "You're saying they've been bluffing this whole time?" Grandpa's grin spread slow and wide. "Not bluffing, son. Lying." But before we could act, Nelson struck again. It was early morning when I heard banging outside. I ran to the window and froze. Nelson and 2 hired workers were unloading construction barriers, slamming them down at the edge of our driveway. They were blocking us in. "Hey!" I yelled, storming onto the porch. "What do you think you're doing?" Nelson didn't even look at me. "HOA order. Your property is under review for foreclosure due to unpaid fines. Access is restricted until further notice." Foreclosure. The word hit like ice water down my back. I turned to Grandpa, who had stepped out behind me, silent. For a moment, I thought he'd explode with rage. But instead, he just shook his head slowly. "You really don't know when to quit, do you, Nelson?" he said softly. Nelson sneered. "And you don't know when you're beaten." Grandpa's grip tightened on his cane. He whispered to me, "Get the camera." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed our old camcorder from the living room and started recording. Every barrier they dropped, every smug word Nelson spat, captured it all. When Nelson finally noticed, his smirk faltered. "You can't film this. It's private HOA business." Grandpa stepped forward, cane tapping against the porch. "This is my land, and you just walked into the biggest mistake of your life." That night, after the barriers were set and the HOA left, we sat in silence at the table. My chest ached with fear. "Grandpa," I whispered, "what if they win? What if they really take the house?" He reached across the table, his weathered hand covering mine. His grip was warm, steady. "Listen to me. They can take my car, my pension, even my pride. But this house, this family, no paper, no fine, no bully can ever take that away. Not while I'm breathing." His voice trembled with emotion, and for the first time, I saw tears welling in his eyes. It broke me. I leaned forward, hugging him tightly. "We'll fight them, Grandpa, together." And I meant it. Little did I know the fight ahead would reveal secrets, bring the sheriff to our door, and test us in ways we never imagined. And it all began with bacon grease. The morning after they blocked our driveway, the sun rose over a street filled with whispers. Neighbors lingered on sidewalks, pretending to water plants or fetch papers, their eyes darting toward our house, where orange construction barriers boxed us in like criminals. I felt shame twist in my stomach. Even though we had done nothing wrong, that was the worst part of the HOAs. power making innocent people feel guilty. But Grandpa wasn't ashamed. He stepped out onto the porch in his flannel shirt and work boots, cane steady, chin high. He wanted the neighbors to see him, to see that he would not bow. "They think this'll scare me," he said, gazing at the barriers. "But all it does is prove I was right about them. And today, son, we're going to prove it to everyone else too." By noon, Nelson was back. Clipboard in hand, 2 more board members at his side. He strutted up like a sheriff in an old western, though his voice carried none of the dignity. Well, he drawled. "Looks like foreclosure day came early. Better start packing, old man." Grandpa didn't flinch. Instead, he held up the deed he'd uncovered, the yellowed paper trembling in the breeze. "You see this?" Grandpa's voice carried across the street, drawing neighbors closer. "This deed was signed before your HOA ever existed. This land, this house, it's exempt, which makes every fine, every letter, every so-called violation you've thrown at me worthless." Gasps rippled through the small crowd of neighbors. Nelson's smugness cracked. That doesn't matter? "The board has authority. The board has no authority over something that was never under its rule," Grandpa interrupted, voice rising. "And I've got proof. On paper. And on camera." I raised the camcorder high, red light blinking. Every neighbor could see it. Every word Nelson had spat yesterday. Every barrier dropped, it was all recorded. For the first time, Nelson looked nervous. But before he could reply, the growl of tires filled the street. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up, dust swirling behind it. Deputy Collins stepped out. Broad-shouldered man, everyone in town respected. He took one look at the barriers and frowned. "Morning, folks," he said evenly. "Somebody want to explain why private property's been barricaded without a court order?" All eyes turned to Nelson. He stammered. This is HOA business." "It's a compliance matter." Collins raised a brow. "Funny, because the county clerk's office called me this morning. Got a complaint from this gentleman here." He nodded toward Grandpa. "They confirmed the deed checks out. This property was never under HOA jurisdiction." Gasps again. A neighbor even clapped a hand over her mouth. Grandpa's eyes glistened, but his voice was steady. "Told you, Nelson. You can't build power on lies." Nelson's face turned crimson. "You can't do this. You can't just..." But Collins cut him off. "Son, what you've been doing is trespassing, harassment, and attempted fraud. You and your board are lucky. The homeowner here hasn't filed civil charges yet. I suggest you pack up these barriers before I find reason to haul you in." For a moment, the world froze. Then, like a balloon popped with a pin, Nelson deflated. He motioned angrily to his companions, and they began dragging the barriers away. The crowd of neighbors murmured, some shaking their heads, others glaring at Nelson as if finally seeing him for what he was. And then something I'll never forget. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. "Mr. Daniels, Mrs. Lopez." The woman from across the street called out to Grandpa, "I'm so sorry. We all saw what they were doing, but we were scared to speak up." Another man added, "They fined me last year for a garden gnome." A garden gnome. "I should have stood with you then." Voices joined, confessions spilling, anger rising, not at Grandpa, but at the HOA that had bullied us all. For the first time in years, Nelson wasn't feared. He was despised. That night, the house was quiet again. No banging, no ladder clanking, no letters slid under the door. Just peace. Grandpa and I sat on the porch, fireflies blinking in the yard, the weight of months finally lifting off our shoulders. "You did it, Grandpa," I said softly. "You stood up to them. And you won." He rocked slowly in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. "It wasn't about winning, son. It was about reminding them, and maybe reminding myself, that you don't give bullies power by bowing your head." I swallowed hard, his words sinking deep. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked after a while. "All the fighting, the stress?" He thought for a long moment. "No, because every stand we take carves out a piece of dignity. And dignity, once given up, is near impossible to reclaim. I want you to remember that long after I'm gone." My chest tightened, tears burning my eyes. I reached over and squeezed his hand. "I will, Grandpa. I promise," he smiled. And in that moment, I saw not just my grandfather, but a man who had carried the weight of generations, protecting what mattered most. Weeks later, the HOA held an emergency election. Nelson was voted out, along with the entire board that backed him. The neighbors, once silent, once fearful, had found their voices in Grandpa. He became a quiet hero on our street. Not because he fought with anger, but because he fought with truth. Whenever I walk by that old ladder in the garage, still stained with a faint sheen of bacon grease, I can't help but smile. It wasn't the grease that brought justice. It was Grandpa's courage. And maybe, just maybe, it reminded all of us of something we'd forgotten. Home isn't just walls and a roof. It's where dignity lives. It's where family stands together. And it's worth protecting not with fists, but with faith, truth, and sometimes just a little bacon grease.